Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Turok 2 Seeds of Evil, originally for Nintendo 64 but later re-released on PC. What you're seeing here is the remastered version done by Night Dive Studios that was released about a week or so ago. At least as I'm recording this video at the end of March 2017 anyway. This is a first-person shooter and the sequel to Turok Dinosaur Hunter. It was developed by Iguana Entertainment, originally published by Acclaim back in 1998 for Nintendo 64, and it saw a release on PC the following year. And like I said, the remastered version was released not too long ago as I'm recording this video. It was on March 16th of this year, 2017. So it's been brought back, which if you go by the original Turok standards is not necessarily the best of things unless you're a hardcore FPS fan. Which of course brings up the question of whether or not Turok 2 escaped that curse and ends up holding up better. Let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out. Well, as far as presentation goes, it's definitely a lot better than the original Turok, and even today, if you look back on what they were working with, it's incredibly impressive. Even though the Nintendo 64 version is held back by a very low frame rate that's barely even playable, as well as the pitifully low draw distance and the very low res of everything, they still managed to pack a lot of detail into the environments, into the characters, and especially the animations, which are glorious. This is kind of a lost art among first-person shooters. It's something that the old-school FPSs had that modern ones don't, because modern games tend to use a lot of ragdolls, they tend to use a lot of canned animations that are relatively realistic, but Turok 2 goes into completely over-the-top and ridiculous territory. Oh no, it's not enough that you just happen to shoot the reptilian creature. No. You blew its head off and now it's spewing blood like a fountain while its body staggers around like crazy. You set enemies on fire, they will actually start running away from you, flailing around. You hit them with, say, an exploding shotgun shell and they go flying. It's just glorious carnage. And that's all on top of the extremely well done character animations. Even though they're relatively low in the frame count, they've still done an excellent job of making all of them very smooth and very fluid, and actually flow together very, very well. It actually even puts some modern games to shame in that regard, and that is nothing short of amazing. And if you're used to modern games where they rely pretty heavily on ragdolls and motion capture, it's a wildly different experience. There was just this sense back in the 90s that first-person shooters really weren't meant to be taken all that seriously. They were supposed to be fun, over the top, and full of absolute carnage, and that is precisely what Turok 2 does. And the attention to detail in the animations even spills over into the other visuals as well. Despite being rather low on the polygonal count, the modeling is surprisingly detailed, the textures are surprisingly detailed despite being very low res. The game has plenty of color, it's just a very appealing game to look at despite being almost 20 years old at this point. Sure, it looks dated, but that's actually a lot of the charm. It's from a bygone era, and it oozes that from every pore. And that even happens when you move over into the sound design, where things get considerably better than the original game. For one, there's quite a bit more voice acting in this than the original game. The original game had "I am Turok!" which, as you can see, they kept for the sequel, but they also expanded the voice acting. There's quite a bit more speech in this game than there was in the original. You have someone actually telling you what your objectives are and why you're doing what you're doing. Sure, the voice acting's still rather cheesy, but again, that's part of the charm. When you move into the rest of the sound design, you find that the sound effects are definitely improved over the original game. The weapons just sound beefier, which is always nice. The ambient noise does a surprisingly good job of generating atmosphere. They've got really nice sound effects for all of the enemies. And it all just ends up sounding more professional than the original game. But then there's the one thing that is going to be really hit or miss for you depending on which version of the game you played. And that would be the soundtrack. You see, the PC and Nintendo 64 versions actually had different soundtracks, in that one of them was CD audio, and the other was limited by the fact that it was running on a 32 megabyte cartridge. So while PC audio back in the day had cleaner sound, the N64 version just has this harder edge to it. It's surprisingly more atmospheric and more action-packed than the PC version's music. Now, if you played the original versions of the game, the original N64 or the original PC version, you were stuck with one or the other, but with the remastered version, you can actually select between either one. Which is great, because I considerably prefer this to this. But hey, that's just my personal preference. You may prefer the PC audio for all I know. That's fine, because either way, you're getting a pretty kick-ass soundtrack, actually. It strikes a good balance between action and atmosphere and ends up fitting the game extremely well. And when you bring that together with the rest of the presentation, it actually ends up holding up very well in the long run. Sure, there are certainly issues. Like I said, in the original release, the draw distance was terrible, the frame rate was horrible, and you also had an issue of the FOV being pretty low, but those are all things that are actually fixed in the remaster, so if you're going into it now with the remastered version, you're actually getting a better presentation than you ever have. There were definitely problems that held the original game back, and it's actually kind of interesting just how much better this game holds up when you're not having to deal with those problems. Because let's face it, this game being a sequel to the original Turok means that it has the original game's issues to overcome on top of the issues that are present in just it being an N64 game. And those issues are primarily in what really matter here, which are the story and the gameplay. Now, the story in this is that you are a new Turok, which, if you're not familiar with Turok, it's basically a title that is passed down from warrior to warrior. This time, you are Joshua Fireseed, and you are summoned to a bizarre place in space by an alien named Adon. She tells you that you've been summoned in order to defeat the Primogen, which is trying to escape the confines of its ship, only to basically destroy the universe. Because escaping the ship would require destroying the energy totems that are keeping the Primogen stuck there, and that would cause a chain reaction that would ultimately wipe out the universe, which is really not that great of a plot. Sure, it helps to give meaning to what you're doing there, because you're going through and you're fighting hordes upon hordes of these evil creatures that have been summoned by the Primogen to do its bidding. And Adon gives you a summary of the locations that you're going to and what they were like before the Primogen's forces came along and just completely demolished the places. But there's really not much story to go around in this game. There's definitely quite a bit more than the original Turok, because the original Turok pretty much didn't even have a story, but the story does take a back seat to the gameplay here, even though the cutscenes are actually unskippable, which gets pretty annoying. The thing is, since it's a 90s FPS and it plays like a 90s FPS, you can kind of forgive the story not really being all there. Because this game does one thing and one thing only. Take what the original Turok did and make every single bit of it better. The first major problem that the original Turok had was that its level design was pretty much labyrinthine and confusing and required a crap ton of backtracking. For the most part, the level design in this one is definitely better, until you get to the Lair of the Blind Ones, which can go f*** itself. Seriously, that level friggin' sucks, but the rest of the levels are mostly fine. They do a pretty decent job of being laid out in such a way that they have a fairly natural progression from one area to another. Sometimes they lapse into the kind of backtracking that you'd experience in the original Turok, but it's not quite to that same degree. Because while you are kind of doing the same thing, where you go through the levels, you collect a bunch of keys for the next level to unlock, and then you go to that next level, you repeat the process until eventually you get to the final boss, you're not having to go back through the entirety of the level going, wait a minute, what did I miss? Where the hell is that last key? Except in the Lair of the Blind Ones, but that's beside the point. The real point is that even though the levels can get fairly labyrinthine, there's usually some indicator of where you're supposed to go next, and it's not just the fact that the remastered version actually has various markers that get placed on the maps. Which, as you can see in the footage, I disabled, so if you're going to start screaming about that, it's an optional feature. Granted, those icons are very obtrusive and really stand out, so they're really not that great to have anyway. That said, if you want something a bit more old school to help you navigate the levels, there is an auto-map feature, and yes, this was in the original release as well. And it can be fairly handy if you've managed to get yourself turned around and need a quick reference for, oh hey, I need to go back this way instead of going this way because I've just been going around in circles. But unlike in the original Turok, you don't really need the auto-map to be able to finish the game. Like I said, the levels flow together fairly well, so you don't really find yourself using the auto-map all that much. Although it's not like it would really help you all that much in the Lair of the Blind Ones, but again, that's beside the point. The thing is, the level design is certainly not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. It still does require backtracking, it still can get a bit confusing at times. So while it's definitely a lot better than, and frankly a lot more interesting than the level design in the original Turok, there was still definitely some work to do in that front. Luckily, most of the other elements of the game compensate for that. Remember how the weapon selection was fairly bland in the original Turok, but definitely serviceable and fairly satisfying to use? Wait until you get your hands on the arsenal in Turok 2. You have most of the weapons returning from the original game. You got your basic bow and arrows, pistols, certain melee weapons, you've got shotguns, grenade launchers, things that are definitely still satisfying to use, but definitely not all that interesting. And then there's the fun stuff. How about a shotgun that shoots a single core projectile that then, once it hits something, splits into a bunch of different projectiles that start ricocheting all over the place? What's that? You want to turn up the heat? Here, have a flamethrower. Been watching too many 80s action movies lately? Well, how about a razor disc that you throw and then comes back to you? But even awesome stuff like that takes a backseat to what has become one of the most iconic weapons in first-person shooter history. And if you've played Turok 2, then you know what I'm talking about, and you're probably giggling like a maniac right about now. Feast your eyes upon the cerebral bore. This particular weapon only works on sentient enemies, so things like the reptilians, or the mantids, or the cyborgs that you'll run into throughout the course of the game. The humanoid enemies, basically. It launches a seeking projectile that latches onto an enemy's head, drills into their skull, and then blows their head apart. It's the kind of thing a supervillain would come up with. It's absolutely glorious! And even if you aren't using something that's completely over the top like that, the entire arsenal is just a joy to use. There's only basically 2 or 3 weapons in the entire game that really aren't viable, and one of them is a spear gun that you can only use underwater, so it's pretty much useless, and another of which just doesn't seem to do much of anything, although it has infinite ammo and recharges, so there is that. The game actually has location-based damage, so even if you're using something like the bow and arrow or the pistol, you can actually get headshots and instantly drop just about any enemy in the game. And in an even better bit of attention to detail, the arrows will actually stick in enemies, and you can go and pull the arrows out of those enemies. Well, at least the normal arrows anyway. The tech arrows can't be recovered, but you can recover the normal arrows and just reuse them. Which is probably a good thing, because the ammo capacity is still an issue in this game. Sure, you have a pretty wide arsenal available to you, and some of the weapons actually have infinite ammunition, so that's always nice. But you will very frequently be running out of ammunition for most of your so-called power weapons, things like the shotguns, the launchers, flamethrowers, etc. The ammunition capacity you have is just absolutely minuscule. I mean, you can only carry 20 shotgun shells, and there's no way to increase that. And you can only carry half of that number of exploding shells. Luckily, unlike the original Turok, you can actually switch between the ammunition types, but it's still frustrating. Nobody likes having to scramble for ammunition because you're fighting a bunch of enemies that you just can't seem to get good hits on. And when you run out of ammo, you're pretty much completely screwed in this game because the game's actually pretty stingy on the amount of ammunition that it gives you in the course of the levels as well. So it actually encourages you to be more patient and go for headshots more than anything else, which is a bit counterintuitive sometimes, because sometimes those headshots don't really trigger all that well. With some practice, you can definitely get some reliable results down, but ultimately, you're still going to have some issues with ammunition throughout the course of the game. They do sort of mitigate this by giving you checkpoints scattered throughout the levels that you can actually replenish your ammunition at, but you can only do that once per level. And your other options at checkpoints are to restore your health, which again you can only use once per level, and to do a quick warp, which will allow you to warp to either one of the other levels or to warp to one of the points within the level that you're actually on. And that can be particularly handy if you have some backtracking to do, because there's one particular aspect of this game that requires some pretty heavy backtracking, and that is the supernatural abilities that Turok can get. To get those, he has to collect a feather, and then take that feather back to a special chamber in order to unlock the special ability. These allow you to access different parts of the map than you normally would, which is also required if you're going to get the Primogen keys, which allow you to fight the final boss of the game. That particular part of the game can get especially frustrating. But even then, because you actually get a special ability out of it, it's still not quite as frustrating as it was in, say, the original Turok. They definitely could have handled it a lot better than they did, though. But then there's other aspects of the game that are definite improvements over the original. There is considerably less platforming in this game, and that is greatly appreciated because the platforming in the previous game sucked. The enemy AI is considerably improved over the previous game. The AI in the original was incredibly stupid. It would either charge you directly to try to melee you, or it would just hang back and shoot at you for a while before trying to close the gap. Here, there's a distinction between the more intelligent enemies and the enemies that are meant to be stupid and just charge right in. The ones that charge right in are pretty much what you would expect after having played the original Turok, but the more intelligent enemies will actually hang back, they'll shoot at you from a distance, they'll even take cover. And they'll actively try to get away from you if you're getting too close to them, and they'll try to attack you in groups. It's actually kind of impressive for 1998. Of course, there are certain enemies that are rather small and hard to hit because they're also pretty quick, so that can be kind of frustrating to deal with, but other than that, it makes the combat a lot more dynamic and interesting than what you would expect after having played the original Turok. The save system also saw a bit of a revamp. The N64 version still had checkpoints, but on PC you could actually save anywhere, and that carries over into the remastered version as well. And that is much appreciated because the checkpoint save system in the original Turok was pretty irritating. It's just a shame they couldn't work something out for the Nintendo 64 version. And they even managed to put in a multiplayer mode. Now, on the N64 version, you had split-screen multiplayer between up to 4 players, but the PC version has quadruple that number on network play. And while the multiplayer is certainly not going to be winning any awards, especially compared to the competition of its day, it's still a pretty solid multiplayer mode that's fun to play for a while. And when you bring everything together, what you have here is a game that completely supplants the original Turok. It's still not something I would recommend to every gamer out there, but it's much more amenable to FPS fans because they improved the mechanics pretty considerably. The level design is much improved and much more interesting than the previous game, except for one particular level, the Lair of the Blind Ones, which can go f*** itself. This game actually has a story compared to the original, which barely had anything remotely resembling a story. It has top-notch presentation for its day that surprisingly holds up rather well, and then on top of all of that, they added a multiplayer mode to extend the longevity of the game. And even though they didn't fix everything that was wrong with the original Turok, it's still a prime example of how to do a sequel really well. Is it perfect? By no means. Is it a really fun experience that occasionally gets frustrating when you have to do some backtracking? Yes. Is it for everyone? No. I'd still say that only really hardcore FPS fans need apply here, FPS enthusiasts that are willing to put up with the rough edges that this thing has. But if you can put up with those rough edges, you got something of a gem here. And the remastered version actually helps bring out those qualities a lot better than the original PC version, or especially the N64 version did. Those were held back by frame rate problems, by FOV issues, by other technical problems that were a result of it being pushed too hard on too weak of hardware and not really being the best coded engine to begin with. The remastered version basically fixes those technical problems and lets you actually enjoy the game for what it is rather than what it could be. And what you have here is a real classic of that fairly early stage of 3D first-person shooter development. And if you are interested in picking up a copy of this, I will have links in the video description box where you can pick this up on GOG or Steam if you're interested. In fact, it's actually cross-compatible between the two versions because they allow GOG Galaxy and Steam Play on it. So if you got the GOG version and you're like, dang, I wanted to play with my friends on Steam, well, you can actually do that because they have the cross-play compatibility there, which is actually a really nice feature. Night Dive just did a really great job with the remastered version on this thing. Thanks for watching.